When we think about rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos, pathos and logos are generally much more easier to understand. Pathos being anything that creates an emotional impact on the reader, an emotional impact that will drive them to come to a certain conclusion or believe in whatever ideas you're presenting in your writing. And then logos obviously is just any kind of argument, any factual data that you provide in order to support your position. Those two are pretty easy to identify, pretty easy to replicate. Students, however, do have a harder time with identifying ethos. Ethos being the credibility of the communicator. What makes this person qualified to speak about whatever topic that's being discussed? This is important when you're looking for sources to cite in a piece of writing. Understanding what their ethos is can help you immensely, especially when we're trying to figure out how credible they are, which is the crux of what ethos is. What happens with some students is that they confuse ethos with ethics. Ethos and ethics both sound similar, so it makes sense that those two things can be confused. Abridged history. Ethos initially did originally just refer to someone who was ethical. It came from Aristotle in ancient Greece. He had the idea of ethos, pathos, and logos when communicating ideas. But as time, as it does, changes the meanings of words and new ideas come about, the idea of the rhetorical situation in the modern sense took ethos and expanded on it so that it meant more than that. Ethics is derived from ethos. It has roots in Greek, and if I'm remembering correctly, it also has roots in French, to where it does just refer to the ethics of a person, their morality, whether or not they're good or bad. And so when we're looking at a rhetorical analysis, we are looking at a new definition of the term that incorporates that issue of one's moral character with the elements of their life that actually give them credibility to speak on a subject, their professionality within a subject, their expertise in it. That's a better word to use. So confusing ethos and ethics, while it does often in a modern sense dock you some points in rhetorical analysis, there really isn't, if you look at the history of the word, a lot of shame in getting the two mixed up. But what needs to be understood when talking about this, especially in the context of a rhetorical analysis, is that ethics and ethos are not one-to-one similar. They're not necessarily the same thing. When we look at ethics, what we're looking at is the character of the speaker. Are they a good person? Are they someone who lies often? Are they someone who does charity work, especially in conjunction with whatever they're speaking about? Someone who's an environmentalist who also litters probably doesn't have, or you can't say that they have good character. And so if they litter and they're also preaching about saving the environment, we might not necessarily trust them as an ethical authority on that topic. So character is the basis for what ethics means. Someone with high moral character, someone who doesn't tell lies, that's someone who you can trust to give you information. Ethos, on the other hand, has to do with credibility in general. Now that credibility can come from their character. Again, someone who doesn't lie is going to be more credible than someone who does lie. But that said, we have the same issue here where credibility and character, again, aren't necessarily going to be equivalent. Character, as we understand it, is specifically in relation to ethics. Credibility, however, can come from a number of different places. And for the sake of this, I'm going to divide credibility into two different types. So first, you have credibility from occupation. And this just means that this is someone who works within the field that they're talking about. An astrophysicist who is telling you about astrophysics is going to be credible. They're going to have more credibility than someone who doesn't work in that field. Someone who farms for a living on an industrial farm is going to know much more about that than someone who simply Googles information about work on an industrial farm. So occupational experience is going to give someone credibility. But then you also have a different kind of experience, which I'm just going to call experiential. So we have experiential credibility and occupational credibility. Experiential has to do with, this is self-explanatory, having experience with something. For example, if we have an individual who was present at a riot, then that person is going to know a lot more about what was going on in that riot than someone who studies behavior for a living. Because although they can study the behavior of the people as they see it in footage of this riot, they weren't there to speak to the actual behaviors of people as someone who experienced it firsthand. Now, if someone were present at that riot and also studied cognitive psychology, then that would give them 2 layers of credibility in terms of that. So occupational and experiential can overlap, but generally you do end up looking at one or the other. Reading any article, you want to know if the person who's writing it has experience. Articles about disease, about health, whether it's physical health or mental health, you want that to be written by someone who is qualified to speak about that, someone who maybe has a PhD in that field, an MD, whatever the case may be, versus someone who is maybe just a staff writer for a website and just accumulated their knowledge through their own research. So occupational and experiential also are not correlated one-to-one, but occupational and experiential are both factors that tie into an individual's credibility. And then you have the combination of their credibility and their character that creates their overall ethos. So here we see that we can't just talk about ethics. We can also use the character as a secondary filter to determine if that person can be trusted. But both of these things, credibility and character together, create ethos, which is credibility or trustworthiness. Whenever you're doing a rhetorical analysis, you want to be careful not to purely look at the ethics of an individual and make sure that you're also exploring what gives them that credibility to speak on that topic. Use those things together, and that's going to help you create a balanced answer in terms of how much weight you're going to give to the word of that communicator in a research paper, if you're using them as a source, or if you're simply doing a rhetorical analysis and are asked to evaluate the credibility of the author.